Okay, in this video, we're going to put some pieces together that make the image look more realistic and believable. And you can make a surrealistic image. You know, we saw the one in the samples where the guy was floating in his living room with a bunch of stuff flying around. And that's one use of, compositing in Photoshop. The other ones with the cars and the product design, those are other more practical uses of Photoshop and layering. And that's the huge difference between Photoshop and Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, is that you're going to put pieces together that you couldn't actually do within those other two programs. So that's, in my opinion, Photoshop's strength, is to be able to do those kind of composites and edits and that kind of thing. So what we want to do, and we'll try to keep this simple, I'm just going to put together a couple pieces that normally wouldn't be together and try to make them look like, they might be realistic. And so some of the things you're going to be looking at, and we'll get into this, and they'll be listed in the course materials as text, is when we put pieces together, we need to keep an eye on highlights and shadows and reflections and so on. So what I want to do is take this image and bring in this image. Obviously, you're not going to have an apple in a field without a tree, but we're going to put them together to kind of see how we can make it work. So first thing we need to do is mask off our pieces. Now I can move this in first and then mask it off, or I can mask it off and then move it in. 6 of one, half dozen the other. It's whatever you like to, or the way you like to approach it. Now what I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to mask it here. I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document so that way I can use that apple for whatever other purposes I might need down the line. So again, quick selection tool to get us started. And we're going to get that going. Awesome. So again, we have the background is selected. Now in the previous example, we went under layer, layer mask, and we said hide selection. I'm going to go down here to the layers palette at the bottom. This little icon right here, this little round one or square one with the circle in it, is the layer mask icon here. The little tab is popping off my screen, so we're not capturing that. But it's the add layer mask icon. Now if I clicked it right now, notice because the background was selected, it kept the background visible, and then it hid the foreground. So I'm going to undo that. Edit, undo. And if you still want to use that mask, you hold down the Option or the Alt key, and it does just the opposite. So it will hide the back or hide the selected area if you hold down the Option or the Alt key. It will show the selected area if you don't, if you just click on the icon here. So it's a nice little shortcut way to get through this and save yourself a little bit of time by just clicking a couple buttons. I'm going to double click the name, give it a name that I can actually recognize. I'm going to do a file, save as, because I want to change the name, Apple. I'm going to save it to my desktop again. Click Save, and now my Apple Photoshop document is ready to go. Now I want to move it over into this field image, and again, with Photoshop being tabbed like this, you can duplicate this layer. So initially we went up here, layer, duplicate layer. That's one approach. You can go to the layers palette and you still have that similar type of menu. Click on that corner here so you can see that little line icon, layer, duplicate layer. Or what we can do is just drag this layer. Now when you have it tabbed, it's a little trickier, but it's not hard. I'm going to drag this layer by the name. I'm going to drag it up on top of this. When it pops open, I'm going to drag it back down, and there it is. There's my apple in the field. So you can duplicate layer from here, you can duplicate layer from over here, or you can just drag it. It does make it easier if they're separate windows. If I drag this off, there's separate windows, and if I drag the apple from here over, I can drag it on top of there, and it would drag in another copy of the apple. I don't need that right now, but the idea here is that I have separate windows. So there's different ways to do it. That's Photoshop for you. Okay, so now we have our apple in the field. I'm going to do a file save as, or I click save. So I'm going to do a save as. We'll call it apple field. Desktop and save. All I did was hit return to hit save. Okay, now I need to get this apple at least size so it actually doesn't overwhelm my whole screen. So again, under edit, free transform, I'm going to resize that. Now if you can't see the corners here, if I hit this, it should, in newer versions of Photoshop, it will allow you not to distort it. And that's because this link here is connected, meaning this percentage and this percentage will stay the same, which is very handy. But let's say for some reason you can't see those corners, so you can drag something. You can always type in a number up here. So let's say we want to make that 40%. As long as this link is connected, you will maintain the proportions and they'll stay, the same. So here I can find, okay, that's probably a good spot or a good size. Let's put it right here. Put it a little bit in our foreground, maybe a little bit bigger, because this picture was shot in the Big Apple, if you will. Just kidding. And so, yeah, that's probably good. That's close. And a couple things as you're putting pieces together, you do want to keep an eye on perspective and angles and stuff like that. In this demo, we'll go ahead and show you how to add some highlights and shadows to blend it into the actual image. But for right now, I think we'll just keep it like this. We've got it sized where we want it. Maybe a little too big. Good. So I got it positioned. We can always move it later, but I think this is probably a good spot for it right now. I'm going to just double click inside, or again, hit the check mark at the top. And now it's free transform. So on our original image here, we did our preliminary masking and we saved it. It doesn't do you any good to fine tune the masking in the apple layer here because you may or may not have more work to do when you bring it in. Pretty much, if this was dialed in just without minimal effort or with minimal effort, you'd be done, instead of trying to labor over making it perfect in the other document. So sometimes I wait to fine tune the mask when I bring it into the actual image it's going to end up in. So here we have our image here, and the quick selection tool did a pretty darn good job at selecting it. The edges are a little light and a little, with a little like white outline here, especially right around here, and we can fix that. And so what I'm going to do is, if you're on any of these selection tools, you'll have this option here, or I can just double click the layer mask as well. So I'm going to double click this, and I just double click the layer mask of the apple layer, and I'm going to click on selected mask. Okay, so now you get this new panel here, and it happens to be set on layer. So let's kind of take a rundown of what these things are. Under the view here, you can say I want to show it on layers, so it shows any layers in the background. Onion skin basically kind of shows it translucent through it. Marching ants, as if it was a selection. With an overlay, kind of the quick mask look that we had, in last week's work. If you want to see it directly on black or on white, or as the mask itself, just black and white, you can choose any of these options here. Personally, I prefer to use it on layer so I can see how much it's working and how much more I have to change or when I'm done. So I click that, and so you can do a high quality preview, so it really shows you the edges correctly, show the original before you make any changes, and then show the edges of it if we make any edge changes. So we haven't done that. But for this one, we can keep it super duper simple, and I'll come back and we'll look at some other samples where we can actually get really, really good results on masking by manipulating some of these sliders and other features. Okay, so here on this, I want to go in and just clean up the edges here. And so one of my techniques I've used for years, and I finally saw a video on this guy who actually does the same thing. He called it his secret sauce, but I've been doing it for years, and I'm kind of glad just to see the reinforcement. And so I changed the feather. So notice when you change the feather, I'm going to overdo it, so it's going to soften the edges of that mask. And so remember, we do have it masked. We just, it's not precise yet. So I'm going to increase the feather. In this other video I saw, it was like he went up to 3 or 4%. I usually only keep it at like 1 or below. I just want a little bit of, softness to it. And then what I do is I increase the contrast. So let's zoom in here so we can actually see this area. So obviously that doesn't look right. We'll come back to this edge here, afterwards. So don't worry about that. Now I'm going to increase the contrast. Notice, now if I overdo the contrast, see how pixelated or sharp it gets? But if I increase the contrast to a bit, we get a good result. Maybe I will go up to like 3 and increase the contrast. You don't want it to be too pixelated, and too rough. No, that's too much. We're losing, if you do it too much, you lose the scalloped edges or the detail. So it depends on what you're doing and how much detail you have in the image to pick the feather either higher or lower. In this case, I'm going to keep it a little bit lower, increase the contrast. And what I want to do next is I want to shift the edge. Now if I overshift it, if I move it to the right, it's going to make the edge thicker. If I undershift it, it's going to cut in too much. Notice that there's no longer like a transition here. So what I want to do is I want to lower the shift just until that edge goes away. And typically, let's see here. Yeah, so my secret sauce, if you will, was the contrast and the shift were almost the same. One's a positive number, the other one's a negative number. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but, you can definitely get it so that it's tighter. And so if we show the original, before and after, we are a lot tighter and a lot better. So I'm going to zoom back out a little bit so we can see. Now it looks a lot better. Again, original and after. So definitely integrates better. Stuff like this edge or this little notch here, you're going to have to do manually. So, we can't get everything in here. We can get quite a bit, but some of the things you may have to go back in and hand do. So here I'm going to shift the edge. Let me increase the feather. Okay, cool. All right, that's pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And I've refined the edge of my image. Okay, so I want to go ahead and clean up this edge here, this little bitty doodad. Why can't I zoom in? All right, click on my layer. There it is. We're back. Cool. And I'm going to zoom in. Paintbrush. Way too big of a brush. And remember, we'll make sure we're on the layer mask and not on the layer itself. I'm going to zoom in. Use the space bar to pan around. And I'm going to use my left bracket key to make the brush smaller. Try to get in there. Again, zooming in definitely helps. Make the brush a little bit smaller. And again, with black paint, we're going to hide this little area here. If you actually see black paint, or if you're painting with white and you see white paint, double check and make sure you're on the correct layer or on the layer mask, because otherwise you are going to be messing up your image. Okay, that looks pretty good. I think that's fine. One thing we don't see, which is awesome, is the edge. Sometimes when you bring over an image from one document to another, you'll see an edge, floating around. And that's because if I click on the mask, the edge will be part of, it's white out here. So if there was any like extra outside of here, you would actually see it kind of usually as a white outline, but we don't see that here, so that's great. Okay, so now we have the apple in there. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to show you how to get the apple so the colors and the value kind of mimic how the scene or what the scene dictates. And so then we'll go into the next video and show you some shadows and highlights and making it even more realistic. But for this one, I'm going to go ahead and create an adjustment layer. Again, we want to be non-destructive. So image, adjustments, I'm going to do a curves adjustment. And I'm going to click OK. Oh, sorry. Back up here. Undo curves. It didn't do anything because I didn't create an adjustment layer. Layer, new, adjustment layer. Sorry. I stepped backwards there. Image adjustments would apply the curves directly to the image, not as an adjustment layer. And you undo that for sure if that happens. So layer, new adjustment layer, curves. So I was wondering why it didn't seem to work out right. So you may see this dialog box pop up. If you remember the video on the reflection on the foam, we used what's called a clipping mask. I'm going to click on this because this curves adjustment, what will happen is it will only apply to the apple layer and not to the background. So let me click OK. I check this off, click OK. Notice we got the little arrow pointing down and the layer below it has the underline. That just means any adjustments we make are only going to apply to the apple. Okay. Now if I didn't have that, so if I go under layer release clipping mask here and I made an adjustment, it applies to the whole image. So is a case when you want to apply something to the whole image and a case when you want to apply it just to the layer below. And this is the case where we want to apply it just to the layer below. Now if you make an adjustment here and you get it all kind of wonky and stuff, you can click on this icon here and to reset it, and that'll reset it back to its default value. So with this layer selected, I'm going to remake our clipping mask. So layer, create clipping mask, and now I can move this in, and I'm taking my cues from the image behind here. So we're looking at the contrast, the brightness, kind of the saturation, all that stuff. And so here we're going to move this over. So the black point we're moving over, and that will effectively increase the contrast. Anytime you move this edge closer to this edge, you're changing the space in between the extremes, the black and the white, and that will increase the contrast. So here, that looks probably pretty good. And then if you needed to push up to make it lighter or pull it down to make it a little darker, you could do that. Let's pull it down just a little bit just to see. It's looking better. Again, looking at the images over here, or the elements over here on the left-hand side, the tree and this little shed, to see, how the lighting is, how subdued it is or how bright it is, and so we're going to mimic that with this adjustment layer, or get it closer anyway. So good. Now we have that, and that's all set. And so we do have work to be done, but on this video I wanted to just to show bringing the pieces in, creating this, setting the scene, and creating this composite here. The next video we'll go ahead and take a look at actually making it look more realistic and integrating it into the scene a little bit, more tightly. So I'm going to do a file, save, and with that, I will see you in the next video.